Hello. Well, we are so excited to begin this journey with you as we implement the travel tracker in your district. We hope that you are excited as well. We're going to begin this task with a little bit of a review of the system. We know that you have been through some demos and seen the system work, but just want to go through a little bit as a refresher of how the system is going to flow before we talk about your approval and how you do business there in your district. So, as you will probably remember, the entire system is automated. It is driven through email. So if it's someone's turn to do something in the system, they're going to be notified through their email. It is cloud-based, and so what that means, of course, is that the system is accessible and available on any device, any time, as long as the user can access an internet browser and can log into the system. Now, as you can see from my flow chart here, everything begins with the athletic or field trip request form being submitted. And we allow, of course, any user that has access to your travel tracker to submit a trip request. And that is one thing that you'll be considering in this task is who is going to be responsible for submitting trip request. Once the trip request is submitted, the request will be sent through whatever flow of approvals is needed for your district. We can have up to 10 levels of approval. So in my flow chart here, we just have an example where it's going through 3 levels of approval. School approval, that many times might be the principal, or perhaps maybe the bookkeeper is putting in information, maybe about funding. There may be funding approval, and we'll talk about that there can be designated individuals who are responsible for approving the trip request if a certain funding source is going to be used. We can include board approval for certain trips. Maybe if your district requires the board to approve overnight trips, then we can set that up so that a board person is involved in the flow of approval. Once the trip has been completely approved, you remember that is when the vehicles and the drivers can be scheduled on the trips. We are able to keep your child nutrition and school nurses in the loop, letting them know if there's trips that are going to be taking students away during lunch, or teachers are needing to have packed lunches available for their students. We can keep those school nurses in the loop, letting them know of trips that have students with health concerns on them. We can also keep your bookkeepers notified. There is an option where your district can indicate if a third-party payment is going to be required. In other words, the teacher needs a check to take with them, maybe to pay for the admission to the zoo. Of course, we fully encompass the invoicing piece, and we can generate some fantastic reports for you about your trips and the assignments and the invoicing. Everything can be pulled out into an Excel spreadsheet. So, and you've seen this flow chart before probably, but I just wanted to show this to you to kind of get you thinking again about how the travel tracker flows. So, we're going to look at a trip request form and just kind of touch on the different parts of the request form that you'll see these different contacts involved going through the approvals and the nurses, child nutrition, bookkeepers, and the vehicle and bus or vehicle and driver scheduling. So let me show you an example of a trip request form, and we'll take a look at that here. Now, this is just the demo site. Now, one thing that I want to also bring up here before we get too far into the what you're thinking about with your school contacts and your approval flow is that there are actually up to 4 different types of trips that you can set up in your system. Um, there is some where only your staff is going to be traveling, and then there are other trips that involve students. And so we can have one or the other or both available, as you can see here. Now, in this example, the requester has said this is traveling with students, and then that brings up a drop down of 3 types of trips: athletic trips, field trips, and then special needs trips. And each of these trip types can have a different flow of approval. The field trips and the athletic trips can be completely different. Special needs trips are lumped in with field trips, although we do have some flexibility if you needed to maybe add in another person only on special needs trips. Now, one thing to keep in mind as we are talking about approval flow is that there has to be at least one approver for all trips. So some districts, maybe athletics, don't have an approver. The coach puts it in and the trip happens, and transportation puts a vehicle with it. And that's fine. We can make transportation the only approval, but there will be someone who will have to go in and approve every trip, at least one person. Now, there can be up to 10 levels of approval, and with each trip type there can be different people designated. So some districts might have 6 levels of approval for field trips and only 1 level of approval for athletics, and that's fine. Also, keep in mind that every school location may have different approvers than others, so we can customize each location to the approvers that are specific to their school. The first thing that you want to be thinking about then is what types of trips will your district need? Will you be using staff travel? Will you use the travel tracker to manage staff travel? If not, then we won't have this option for you. In your traveling with students, do you need special needs trips? Is there anything about those special needs trips that has a unique level of approval? One person that's not involved in field trips but does need to be involved in special needs trips that needs to see those requests. So you need to think about that approver. And then, of course, who will be approving, who will be required to approve field trips and athletic trips and those special needs trips, and what types of trips do you need? Some districts don't use special needs trips. They only have field trips and athletic trips. So that's one of the first things that you'll be thinking about. Now, in the flow chart, remember we talked about that there could be a special level of approval for maybe the board needs to be involved. And so what types of trips does the board need to see? Do they need to see overnight, out of state, one or the other? Maybe they need to see something else, a different type of trip. I have a district that uses out of country that the board needs to see. So you'll need to think about that if and when the board needs to be involved in the approval flow. The nurses, we have a question here about if the trip has students with health concerns on it, and how much does what types of trips does the nurse need to be involved in? Who are the nurses at the location? We can have up to 2 nurses listed in your setup tables for each location. So consider those who will be those nurses, and do you want the nurses to be notified, and on what types of trips do you need them to be notified? The funding, we mentioned that there can be funding approvers, and there can be multiple funding sources and different funding approvers. We will get into the funding piece a little later on with another milestone, but I do want to just point that out, that there can be different funding approvers depending on a funding source, if that's something that is needed at your district. Now, the vehicle piece, who is going to be responsible for assigning vehicles from each location. Many districts, transportation assigns every vehicle. The schools don't have anyone designated that manages their vehicles. It's all transportation. Other districts, there is someone in each school that takes that responsibility of assigning vehicles from their school. Perhaps they have a couple of activity buses that they use, and there's maybe the athletic director or the assistant principal assigns those vehicles from that school. So think about who is responsible for assigning vehicles. We'll have a way for you to indicate that. Now, in this request form, I just wanted to scroll down and give you sort of an idea of an example of an approval flow. So, and what it kind of looks like on the request form. So in this particular request, the way we have things set up, there are 4 levels of approval. And the first level is a location approval. And so once this trip request was submitted, this first approver, and you can see an email address, is going to be notified by email that they have a trip request to approve. And they're going to be able to come in and review this particular request and decide whether or not to approve or deny it. If they approve it, then the system automatically generates an email to the next level of approval. So in this example, there is a second location approval. Maybe this is, maybe the bookkeeper needs to see this one, and we can set it up so that the bookkeeper might even be required to add in funding sources. We can put those requirements on either level 1 or level 2 that they need to add in a funding source, or we can make the requester put in the funding source. But we'll get into that later when we talk about invoices and funding. There is an example here for a level 4 approval that is a bookkeeper acknowledgement. So they're just looking at it, making sure everything looks right. The bookkeeper needs to put their stamp of approval on it, so to speak. And then finally, this particular request is going to need the assistant superintendent to look at it as a level 10 approval. You can see we can set it up multiple ways. We have lots of flexibility with the approvals. Think about who needs to approve the trip request coming from each school, and you'll need to provide the App Garden with the email addresses of those individuals. So that's something for you to be thinking about. You will also need to be thinking about the bookkeeper at each school. Those bookkeepers, maybe they're just involved in approval, but they also could be involved in being notified about the invoicing and third-party payments. So if you can find out the person who is responsible for paying invoices at each location, you'll provide that email address as well. Obviously, we've talked about the nurse. You'll provide that information. Child nutrition, I think I skipped over that. The child nutrition question here, will students be away during lunch? And so that's going to notify your child nutrition if they need to have packed lunches, or if there's just going to be 100 children away during lunch, they can make plans to not prepare quite so much food so there's not that food waste. And then what we would call the vehicle owner at each location. Maybe it's transportation, or maybe it's someone specific at each school location that's going to take care of the assignment of the vehicles from that school. So those are the different contacts that we need from your district. Something for you to start thinking about: approvals, contacts like bookkeepers, nurses, child nutrition, and who will be responsible for vehicles being assigned at each location. So there's something for you to think about. And we will be meeting soon when we schedule our first discovery call to talk about this, and then we'll be providing you with a document, a worksheet that you will complete with all this information. So for now, start thinking about that. Get your questions together for our meeting that we will have, and we'll talk more about this, and I'll be able to explain more to you about the approval flow. But this just gives you something to think about before we have our meeting. Thank you so much.